Welcome to South of Left Field. My name is Jimmy. I want to start off today by mentioning that I should have a link to a short article below, an article that I hope my listeners will take a little time to read. It really is a short article, but it introduces a concept from history called a purity spiral, something I'd never heard of till I ran across this article. And they give examples of two events. The Puritan Revolution in the 17th century England as one, the French Revolution as the other. Now, it doesn't sound like that would have a whole lot to do with today. But understand that a purity spiral, as they describe it, is a social phenomenon. It's existed for a long time. I would tentatively add to their list of events that this would relate to as our Civil War. One of the key elements of a purity spiral is that the general population divides itself among an issue or among issues, but generally it's one singular issue. And they begin in their arguments to press one direction or vision or another. They begin to reduce complicated issues of complexity that should be given serious thought, study, and talked about in a nuanced manner. In other words, I don't want to outrage you, but let's just sit down and chew the fat over this thing for a while. And what happens is these complicated issues, as passions rise and as people vie with one another to outdo one another in the force of their passion and the force of their language, these complex issues get reduced to very simplistic moral absolutes. It's the equivalent of what we see on the internet today when someone wants to address something that is widespread, systemic, complex issue, layers like an onion, and their answer to it and their position is represented by a meme. My goodness, if I get the right picture and a dozen of neat, cute little words, I've solved world hunger. That's a meme. We really need to do a little more talking and a whole lot less sharing of memes. Now, in the United States, I said I would put the Civil War up there as a spiral because the Civil War was fought about slavery, and there's a lot of people that would immediately cut me off right there. No. You see, this is part of the requirement for nuanced study of complex issues. Now, I'm not going to argue that slavery was not the founding point of the debate. But if you want to talk about it, you need to understand why people would argue it's states' rights as well. Now, I don't agree with it being states' rights, but just the fact that there's two positions like that point out that it is not really totally simple. Why wasn't this handled at the founding of the country? Well, those wealthy upper class founding fathers, many of whom were slave owners, George Washington, when he married the plantation that he inherited, Mount Vernon, the slaves were originally, by the will of the previous owner, supposed to be freed, and he finagled around and kept them in bondage. He was quite harsh with his slaves. You want to get into complicated issues of slavery? Well, don't forget the writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Oh, there's somebody that's nuanced. All men are created equal, but he kept a very young girl who was a slave and his property, imprisoned in a basement, used her for sex, fathered 6 to 8 children or so. Yeah. So here's the thing, we've got Black Lives Matter and all of that. There's another big nuanced issue. We're tearing down Confederate statues. Yes, the Confederate statues do need to come down. These people tried to leave the United States. They fought and they killed U.S. soldiers. I served as a soldier for my country here for 6 years. And you know what? They'd have shot me dead. So I can't say that I look too kindly, even though I grew up in the Deep South. Can't look too kindly anymore on the statues if that's going to be your argument. But the nuanced issue, let's go back to this. Why didn't they ban slavery when the country was founded? There was already a lot of voices raised to say it was an evil. It was widely accepted in many circles that it was an evil. Well, here's the problem. Many of the leaders, wealth and power and prestige, what allowed them to become the leaders of the revolution, was founded on slavery. Economically, it would have bankrupted them and they would have lost their wealth, which meant they would have lost their influence and their power. It's the way the world works. So, you want to go tear down Jefferson's statue because he was a slave owner? Well, let's go tear down George Washington's statue. He was the same. But then on the other hand, Jefferson's statement, all men are created equal, in the Declaration of Independence. Now, here we go nuanced again. He was talking about white, male, 21, and a landowner. In other words, a person of wealth and substance. These were the only ones allowed to vote. In many of the colonies, and some of the colonies, if you were Catholic, you couldn't vote, even if you were white, male, 21, and a landowner. And if you were Jewish, you couldn't vote. So voting was very restricted back in the day. What he meant when he said all men are created equals, he was talking about men like him. He wasn't talking about women who had no voice, and he wasn't talking about slaves who absolutely had no voice. Fortunately, his words have been changed in our minds. They weren't what he had in mind. And why didn't they try to get rid of slavery back in the day? Because the colonies whose leaders' wealth rested on slavery would have taken their colonies out, and there wouldn't have been 13 states in the United States when it was founded under the Constitution. We'd have been broken into multiple countries. The Founding Fathers knew that the only way the United States was going to be able to survive in that era and that time, right after breaking away from England, was they had to unify. They had to agree to operate as a single country under a single document, and there was no way that they would have gotten that to happen if they had tried to ban slavery at the time. And that's what I mean by nuanced conversations. Folks, it's just not that simple. It's not that simple. And what we have now is a purity spiral where we have two camps screaming invective at each other that has bled into our media so that it is all but impossible to hear any voices of reason. There are no voices of conciliation. There need to be. Yes, things in this country need to change, and we need to address problems that aren't getting addressed. But I can tell you this, as long as we've got two radical camps, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are both radical parties. They are radical parties because what they say about each other is radical. I've actually seen articles begin to appear in various press sources that suggest the possibility that members of both of these parties would be willing to accept an authoritarian government and ditch our 2020 elections that are coming up. Now, this is really radical thinking, and I'm not going to say I give a whole lot of credence to it, but the thing that amazes me is I have to give it some salt because this outlandish idea made it into the mainstream press. Man, if that's not a purity spiral, I don't know what is. The thing about purity spirals is they don't end well. Purity spirals end up in violence. Purity spirals, the one we had over slavery, ended up in the Civil War, for crying out loud. And if you want to see other examples of extreme radicalism and just, turning issues that should be deeply thought about and discussed into moral absolutes, well, we could go to Nazi Germany on that one. That was a purity spiral that went out of hand, didn't it? One of the things that has to exist for there to be a purity spiral is there have to be two parties. I don't think you get a purity spiral when you have 3 or 4 or 5 parties. Now, I argue many times that people need to stop voting for Republicans and Democrats, and I argue it again from this perspective. These two parties are incapable of talking to one another, and their most rabid supporters are incapable of talking to each other. They won't bury the hatchet. They won't seek common ground and compromise. And we got to have that if we want to keep this country together. And I'm going to stop on that note. I appreciate your listening. Please subscribe. Please share. And I hope to see you again in a week here south of left field.